All right, well, it's start time. We'll go ahead and get going and let others catch up as they can. For those who don't know me, I'm Darren Morgan, nursery manager at Shonnard's. Today's class is about summer planting. In other words, planting the vegetable crop that will be your fall, winter, and overwintered crop. It's always kind of a funny class to throw together here in June, where this year we're just barely beginning to feel the beginnings of summer. I'm still planting my main garden because it's been so wet. So it's sometimes a little bit of a shocker to think about the fall and winter garden. But the timing on doing these plantings is so critical. This is the time you need to be starting the process. So that's why we put this on today and give you a chance to plan for it. And for those of you who got flooded out or rotted out all your seed crops or whatever with this incredibly rainy spring and early summer we've had, well, don't despair. Now you have lots of space for fall and winter gardening. So when we talk about year-round gardening in the Pacific Northwest, it's really three different cycles of garden here. Fall harvest crops. These are crops that we'll be harvesting off maybe end of September, first part of October through maybe late November or so, might say up through Thanksgiving, very traditional fall crop cycles.
Awesome. However, that's like a red flag for me when I hear chickens voting out people who have either.
Pardon me, I accidentally muted myself when I was, while I was controlling the access here just a moment. Winter harvest is the next cycle on that. Crops that go through from late November harvest through maybe December, January, possibly even into early February harvest. It's a pretty limited span of crops in that specific window, but it is nice to have some crops available in that sequence. Overwintered crops are crops that are planted essentially as biennial or simply long cycle crops that would be harvested much later in the following year. And that can include cole crops that harvest in March or alliums and root crops that harvest in even May to June or even early July of the following year. All of these crops are crops that are relevant for summer planting and for off-season gardening. So when we talk about crops that you're going to be getting off the garden in the fall, leaf crops, lots of cole crops, very traditional fall crops. Root crops are very commonly the assumption when we talk about fall gardening as the main cycle, and a few fall legumes. Winter harvest crops include some leaf crops. Leaf crop harvest in the winter, even in a mild climate like Western Oregon. There's some tricks to it and some limitations to it, and we'll get into a little more detail on that as we get into it. Winter coles. There are some cole crops such as cabbage that can be harvested in the middle of winter, actually. And then ground stored root crops. So we're talking primarily root crops that would normally be fall harvest root crops rather than long cycle crops for overwintering, but crops that can actually hold in the ground quite late into the winter without deteriorating too badly. And then overwintered crops are, again, leaf crops, a select grouping of cole crops, a very small number of root crops, and again, a couple of legumes. So when we talk about doing these plantings, timing is everything. And there's some thought you need to put into that, because when you look at a package of seed or a six-pack of transplants or whatever, there'll be some sort of indication on there about how long this takes to harvest. But what you need to understand about that is those days are not specifically calendar days. It is what they call degree days. And so degree days are kind of an averaging tool of using high and low temperatures for a given day to figure out how many degree days you have. And right now we're getting more than 1 degree day per day. This is the peak of the season, nice warm temperatures at the longest days of the year. Earlier in the season, and as is important to us for this talk, later in the season, those degree days will dwindle to the point where it takes more than 1 full calendar day to equal a degree day. So we can say, look at a package of seed and says like a parsnip seed might say 120 days, and planted June, you're probably more like 120, 130, 140. But if you waited till August, it would take way too long, 180, 210 days to get enough degree days to match that ripening sequence. As with other types of vegetable crops, some of them are better transplanted, others are direct seeded, or many of them can be done either way. And we'll go over that on a crop by crop basis a little bit later. Plants need time to mature their crop, or for crops that are overwintered, plants need time to get big enough to sustain themselves through the real slow season with all the poor weather. So the timing is critical, the appropriate planting and care is critical. There are great charts available, and there are some on our website. Territorial Seed Company out of Cottage Grove for our area has some excellent fall and winter planting charts that are very accurate. So use them. We do. We look things up every year, even though we're professionals, have been doing this for decades. Still looking things up and following the charts, because you can't remember it all, and it's really good to have that reminder, that reference. So, leaf crops. Fall and winter leaf crops are primarily things you'll be harvesting as a fall crop, but into the winter. In many cases, they don't do super well overwintered, but there are exceptions. Some of your major crops include chard and kale. Those are some of my favorites for fall and winter gardening, and you have a lot of options with handling them. They're truly biennial crops. So if you plant them now, you'll harvest late summer, fall, through the winter into spring. But if you planted them back in April, they would still harvest spring, summer, fall, through the winter, and into the next spring, and still have, and then bolt and go. So while you can plant them late, there are definitely advantages to planting them a little bit earlier, and that's typically what I do in my garden, is grow them as a main sequence crop that continues as an overwintered crop. Other leaf crops really have kind of specific maturation periods. Collards is a good example. If you plant late June to early July, you'll have fall harvest. They're better to push them just a little bit later into the season, because they actually taste better after we've had a couple of good frosts in late October, early November. Mustards are one of the easiest crops to do very late if you get behind on the winter garden. They germinate fairly quickly, even in moderate temperatures. They grow really quickly post-germination, and so you can plant them quite late and still have decent winter and spring harvests. Spinach can be cycled a couple of different ways. Spinach can be planted as a fall harvest crop, planted essentially through middle of July, and then fall and into late fall, although they usually peter out in the winter pretty much. They can then resume in the spring, even without winter protection, but you're not going to winter harvest them without taking some time to actually substantially winter protect them. Lettuce, on the other hand, is not super hardy. It usually needs some degree of cover to overwinter successfully. And if you do cover them, you can actually keep them going quite late into the winter. Often grown more as a fall to winter crop rather than an overwintered crop, but can be done either way. So leaf crops in the winter have some limitations by temperature. And the fact is, with low temperatures and low availability of nutrients because of poor soil biology activity, leaf crops are really slow growing in the winter. So if you're intending to winter harvest, you need to not only plant plenty, but take some steps to encourage a little bit more temperature retention so they can keep growing. So we'll use covers. We'll talk a little bit more about covers late in the presentation, but be aware that most leaf crops grown for fall to winter harvest are just fine with no protection. But if you're really intending to harvest over the winter, you will probably need some degree of covers for them. The exceptions to that really are collards and kale, and they will continue to produce clear through the winter with minimal or no protection, although they'll yield better with some protection. Chard and spinach, our classic Chenopods, survive the winter just fine, but you really don't get much winter harvest without substantial protection. Lettuce, as I mentioned, when we get cold enough, and not every winter do we get cold enough to kill out the lettuce completely, but it's real common for us to get cold enough to kill out lettuce completely. It can regrow if it's got just some minimal protection and give you some either some late winter harvest or even some spring harvest with minor protection. A variety of miscellaneous leaf crops, corn salad or mâché, radicchio and arugula are often planted as fall through winter, may get a second harvest in the spring if you don't over harvest in the fall cycle, and do not need extra protection to do that, but seldom have much actual winter harvest unless you're covering them. So cole crops break up into a few different groups. And cole crops, of course, are your brassicas that are grown not as primarily leaf crops like kale, but for their flower buds normally. Broccoli is one of your classic cole crops, and you have two completely different groupings of broccoli. You have broccoli that is designed for fall harvest, or late summer to fall harvest in many cases. And so planted from June or July, those broccoli will harvest August, September, October. Sprouting broccoli is completely different. So where traditional broccoli sets one nice large head, and then if there's enough time in the season post head harvest, you might get secondary offshoots that continue the production. Sprouting broccoli is a tall, more slender plant with lots and lots of little heads, usually just an inch or two across. So sprouting broccoli is what you grow for overwintering broccoli. You can also grow certain types of sprouting as a main sequence broccoli. And the traditional head-forming broccoli do not make it as an overwintered crop, so completely different varieties. Usual overwintered harvest for sprouting broccoli is March. It goes into April, sometimes as early as late February if the weather is nice. Broccoli is super hardy, and for Western Oregon, we seldom need to provide any extra winter protection just to get it through the winter for overwintering broccoli. So cabbage is a bit different. You plant all your cabbage at basically the same time for fall, winter, or overwintering crops. You just plant different varieties with longer maturation periods. So May or June or July plantings of cabbage will harvest in fall for fall ripening varieties, in December or January for winter harvesting varieties, and February, March for overwintered varieties, all planted at the same time, just longer periods of maturation. Cabbage is also super cold hardy, seldom needing any protection in Western Oregon. Cauliflower is like cabbage in the sense that you plant different varieties all at the same time for a variety of harvest seasons. And typically the same kind of cycle. You might get August, September, October for fall. You might get December or January for winter harvest varieties, and for overwintering varieties, you'll harvest February or March. The main difference in this sense between the cauliflower and cabbage is the temperature sensitivity. Where cabbage is super, super hardy, cauliflower that is winter harvest or overwintered will need protection most years. We really see them fade out below about 15 degrees. And what's worse is the heads that you're actually wanting to harvest are more sensitive to temperature than the parent plant. So while you might have the plant surviving temperatures in the low to mid-teens, if they've already initiated their bud set, those will freeze out, and then you won't get any cauliflower off of them. So plan on winter protecting cauliflower for winter and overwintered varieties. Fall harvest, even for pretty late into the fall, we're not usually cold enough for that to be a risk. Brussels sprouts are a real champion late season cole crop. So planted from a June or July planting, we expect them to be harvested in roughly December or January. You can plant them earlier. People plant Brussels in April, May sometimes. And those are usually summer harvest. But if you can get a later cycle, your Brussels sprouts will taste better. Kohlrabi is one of the hard ones to kind of categorize. So kohlrabi is not really a cole because you're not eating a flower bud, but it's also not a root crop like some of the other brassicas. It's actually a stem piece you're harvesting. So we'll put it in with the coles for the sake of argument here. Usually harvested fall. It can be harvested late fall. If you plant enough to go around, they will hold much better than most root crops into the winter because they're actually above the soil. So they're less subject to rot damage or insect depredation. So they'll ground store well into winter. It's real common to be still eating kohlrabi December or even sometimes January from a technical fall harvest plant. So all of your cole crops have some serious limitations when it comes to growing, and the biggest one is insects. Insect control is a must for all cole crops. Aphids and loopers, of course, are critical problems on developing plants. Aphid control is absolutely essential. Remember that aphids don't really stop in the winter. We'll talk a little bit more about pest control a bit later into the season here. Root crops. So fall root crops, mostly designed for August, September, October harvest. These are your very traditional, you could throw potatoes in here. Technically, a lot of the late harvest potatoes will be harvesting in that cycle as well, especially this year with a late start. But your very traditional fall crops, beets and carrots, turnips and radishes. I throw sweet potatoes in too because you really do want to wait on harvesting them. Where potatoes, you definitely, once they're up to size, you might as well get them out of the ground. Sweet potatoes will continue to grow slowly. And the longer you can leave them in the ground, the better your yield. It's really common for me to be harvesting sweet potatoes in October, even though they were planted clear back in late May or early June. So for sweet potato, the harvesting keys are when you get 2 or 3 frosts and the tops are really beginning to die back, or when we've had enough rain, you're concerned that they may rot if you leave them in the field any longer, typically in mid to late October here. So beets and carrots are usually planted for fall, but can ground store, and some varieties do that better than others. And it's very well worth checking out the differences between the varieties. So we have a little bit more information about that a little bit later on. Turnips are definitely harvest when small enough to be enjoyable, usually somewhere around 3 inches or so. If you really let them sit in ground longer and get bigger, they often degrade somewhat in quality. Radishes can be continued to plant at every few weeks, all spring, all summer, with usually a break during the hottest part of the summer because they don't germinate well when the soil temperatures get too high, and then clear into early October and still continue to ripen and produce. With at peak of season, the period between planting seed for radish and harvesting radish is about roughly 20 to 30 days. Just plant a few every 3 weeks, because how many radishes are you going to eat all at once anyway? A few every 3 weeks throughout the season, and it keeps you continually in radishes well into the fall, or maybe even into early winter at best. Leeks are an incredibly slow developing crop, typically planted in spring for summer harvest into fall, but later plantings of leeks, as in now, will harvest well into the winter, and they're an excellent winter crop to have available. So when we talk about ground storing, it simply means your root crop is ripe, but there's no push to get it out of the ground, and rather than taking up refrigerator space or cold room space, you simply leave them in the ground and pick them as you need them, or as you have more space available for them. There are definite limits here, and insects are one of the significant limits, but the other significant limit here is our moisture. We're an awfully wet climate, and many roots degrade when the soil becomes saturated. So kind of some running through how this works in the root crops. Beets. Beets tend to get corky once they've been in the ground too long, as the soils become increasingly wet. So we find that after maybe mid-December, beet quality is often degrading pretty substantially. If you really want fresh beets out of the ground around Christmas, do varieties that hold better. Flat of Egypt is a classic variety that holds pretty well. Bull's blood holds pretty well. Other varieties, not so much. You know, the pretty little Chioggia, the zoned red and white concentric rings, does not ground store well. It goes bad fairly rapidly in the soil. Carrots are similar. Carrots, we have a lot more slug and bug issues on the tops and shoulders of the carrot especially. And moisture can cause substantial amounts of cracking, splitting, and other deterioration to them. So similar type of cycle. Through end of November, you're probably fine for all varieties. As you're getting well into December, look for varieties that do hold better. Danvers types, boleros are noted for ground storing pretty well here, all in all. We talked briefly about turnips and getting them out before they try to oversize and lose quality. Rutabagas don't usually have that much issue, and you want your rutabagas to get better. It's really common for me to be harvesting rutabagas November and December rather than earlier. They are quite subject to insect damage, soil insects, as well as to slug damage on the shoulders in particular. But aside from that, they typically do hold pretty well and mostly through December, occasionally into January. Parsnips are your champion leave in the ground crop. They have less volumetrically, less number of insects that really like them. So they're less subject to pest problems and moisture problems. They're one of your ideal crops to intentionally plant for December to January harvest to have something coming out of the garden in the complete off season. Overwintered crops are mostly alliums. So onions and garlic and shallots are day-length regulated plants. So it really doesn't matter so much when you plant them. You know you're going to be harvesting them in their cycle. For shallots, that's usually May to early June, garlic, June to July, onions, June to July, or a little past. They can often run a little bit later. So the advantage to planting now is crop yield, is maturation, how much plant you get before they hit the keys that make them start bulbing. So onions, you can plant a variety of different ways. You can plant from seed, you can plant from seedling transplants, you can plant from hard sets, the storage onions, or later in the winter, in February, you can get the green bunches. All of those are still going to mature at roughly the same time. And we're talking in this case about bulbing onions and long day onions, which is pretty much all we grow in the Pacific Northwest. Intermediate day onions are a little bit different. They'll typically yield out sooner. And we don't normally do short day onions here because they mature at the wrong time for our weather cycles. Bunching onions are completely different. They have a much shorter maturation cycle, and because you're not trying to get them to bulb, you can do repeated plantings at different times through the year to have a steady supply of green onions available. Garlic varieties are always best planted from bulbs. You plant them in the fall for harvest in midsummer. And shallots are best done that way, although shallots are sometimes spring planted instead of fall planted with the accompanying reduction in yield. Because in our wet climate, shallots sometimes fail. I've had challenges on my native heavy clay soil getting shallots through the winter with any kind of size at all. An oddball overwintered root crop are overwintered carrots. Not all carrots are suitable for overwintering, but there are a few. Merida and Autumn King are notable. So these are varieties that you intentionally plant late in the cycle, like September, for harvest in roughly April the following year. So legumes, there's not a huge amount of legumes available for this crop cycle. Peas planted now will harvest late summer to fall, subject to insect damage and viral issues, which can happen, but are quite suitable for that cycle. And it's real common for me to be planting them at the end of some early yield crops as a follow-up crop. Later plantings done in August, September can overwinter. I wouldn't bet the whole farm on it though. So September, even early October, peas for spring harvest, very early spring harvest, like March, April harvest. Covers may help them. What helps them more is to go ahead and have some kind of structure up for them to get them started on, and then you can cover if the weather gets particularly vicious. The risk to peas isn't cold and not even usually wet. The risk to peas here usually is other weather impacts, wind, hail, physical breakage from the extremely rough winter weather we sometimes get. Favas are almost always done on this cycle. You seed them in September, October for May to June harvest. They are not as winter hardy, however, as peas. So that's kind of an overview of the crops. Now let's kind of talk a little bit about how we make this happen and kind of the meat of the presentation, actually doing the summer planting. So the first planting cycle is hitting on now, late June through early July, maybe through at the very latest, the middle part of July. Beets can be seeded as early as late June for summer and fall harvest. July or later, and advisedly, because it does take a fair amount of time for beets to mature, are your true fall harvest, your October and later harvests. Carrots seeded in June will harvest summer to fall, depending on variety. Carrots seeded in July, provided you can keep them wet enough to germinate for 21 days, harvest much later into the fall, September, October. Cole crops. If you are starting your own from seed, you would want to be starting them now. That's normally done as started inside for transplanting. Getting a real good yield out of direct seeding is very, very challenging. Usually you would do something like a seedling bed outside and then move your transplants for the ones that succeed on out to a permanent growing location. So why would we do that when there's transplants available? Well, because you can't always get a nice diversity of fall, winter, and overwinter cole crops all at one time to plant as finished transplants commercially. Yes, they are out there. Yes, we do see them. It's a little hit and miss on any given year of how much of a sequence you can put together. When you buy your own varieties from seed, there's just more to choose from. And then you can time your own sequences. And again, I refer to the Territorial Seed Catalog as one of the few seed companies I've seen that does this well. For all of their cole crops where this is relevant, they have a chart within the section that says, okay, for all your cabbages, these are the varieties that would harvest in October, and these would be harvesting in November, December, and these would be harvesting in February, and these would be harvesting in March, April. And that gives you really the best chance to really extend that season as best possible. Kale is easy and forgiving. You can direct seed it if you really want to. I usually transplant. You can plant them in the spring cycle and go all the way through. So it's really common for me to be getting them in the ground in even early May and growing them through the entire season. You can continue to transplant kale quite late into the summer and still get them big enough to successfully overwinter for spring harvest, though maybe not to have a large winter harvest. Leeks, as I mentioned earlier, take an incredibly long time. So if you are seeding leeks now, you're seeding for winter crop. You're actually too late by now to seed for fall crop. On the other hand, leeks are usually readily available from transplants, and you can still transplant now for fall. The end limit to that usually is if you get to the end of July, first part of August, you'd be talking about very late winter or even possibly overwintering the leeks. There's some limits to how fast they'll grow. Lettuce can be seeded throughout the cycle or transplanted throughout the cycle. If you are doing it much earlier than the middle part of July, you're talking about mostly summer harvest. The very end of this earlier summer planting season, say early July, are still mostly going to be summer harvest. Onions, if you are growing your own bunching onions, they can be repeat seeded regularly. If you're growing onions for bulbs, to actually have storage onions or Walla Walla sweet onions, you would be direct seeding outside now. It's not usually the ideal way to do it, but if you're going to do it, this is when you have to do it, June to early July. Parsnips, as I mentioned, 120 days is a really common maturation period for parsnips. Seed planted June to early July is harvested roughly December. Peas seeded now, late June, early July, harvest fall. Radicchio could be seeded for fall harvest and into winter. Radishes, as we kind of discussed earlier, can be repeat seeded about every 3 weeks. Turnips and rutabaga, if you're doing them from seed, which most people do, should be done around early July to maybe mid-July. That'll give you fall to winter harvest. They are crops that can be transplanted and can be handled a little bit later that way. And I find, particularly with rutabagas, I often do some of both just to ensure a good crop. Chard, we already talked about fairly extensively. Seed or transplant anytime through the season, and they're a biennial crop, so they'll continue. Fall harvest, some winter harvest with covers, and then overwintering. So when you're talking about your overwintering biennial crops, to make this work, you need to be moderate in your harvest through the fall and winter, which means you go out and you pick 2 or 3 or 4 leaves off of a given plant and move along. So that gives you some idea what kind of volumetrics you have to get this to work. That's not to say that's it. That's just it for that specific harvest. They'll continue to grow out the center, so you're always harvesting lowest and outermost leaves and working your way up. And as you get into the later part of the winter, you'll notice that they're hardly growing at all, and you'll just normally put a pause on it for a month or so. Starting as early as February, you'll suddenly start seeing them grow, expanding their growth rate fairly dramatically. You can start picking up the harvest then. By the time we're hitting mid-March, they're really expanding, and you need to increase your harvest because you're running out of season. Sometime between the middle part of March and the middle part of April, or at the latest early May, they're going to flower, they're going to bolt. And once they're really pushing flower stalks, just harvest what you can salvage and pull them out of the ground and use the space for something else. There's no sense in fighting the flower stalks. Just go through and change it over. But really, a lot of your harvest on things like kale and things like chard is that February and March harvest as the growth expands. So as we get a bit later into the summer here, mid-July and early August, you can do arugula for winter harvest primarily at that point. Beets seeded through the end of July or maybe first week of August should still fall harvest. You might on the later seedings have a kind of small beets, but they're there. Mid-July is usually when I will transplant my cole crops, whether if I'm buying plants or whether I've started my own. It takes about 4 weeks if you're starting your own to have them ready to transplant. Transplanted cole crops for fall, winter, or overwinter, July through early August. Past mid-August, they're unlikely to finish well, although you might get a marginal harvest. Collards can be transplanted, and really is the best way to handle them. Transplanted in mid-July or later for winter to spring harvest. And kale, as we mentioned earlier, can be continued to be transplanted. It's pretty late to seed it directly. That's when we'd normally do kohlrabi. Kohlrabi can also be done as a spring planted crop for summer to fall harvest, but for my money, the advantage on kohlrabi is to have it later. So you can seed it or you can transplant it July, early August for winter. Lettuce is still ongoing, but this is the window where you're likely to have a gap both in radishes and lettuce, these continuous seeding crops, because they're a little more sensitive than some of the others to overheating the seed. And if you get too hot for any extensive period of time, a certain percentage of that seed just won't germinate at all. So yes, you can continue seeding. Be aware that you might have a gap in here. Leeks by early August is definitely too late. Even by the latter half of July is pretty much too late for seed. You're going to be reliant on transplants if you want to get those in the season. Mustards, this is when we would normally direct seed most mustards for winter harvest. And again, they can be transplanted in the same window of time effectively, but they are easy crops to do from seed. We're at the end of the seeding cycle for onions by second or third week of July for bulbing onions, for overwintering onions. You can still transplant seedlings quite a bit later than that. And bunching onions you can continue to seed. Radicchio going in as a transplant primarily for winter to spring harvest. Radishes we just talked about a little bit. Spinach. Spinach seeded through mid to late July is still likely to get you some fall harvest. By the time you're substantially into August, seeding spinach is likely to yield nothing until spring, but it's hardy. And getting those plants a little bit bigger before they go into winter is definitely beneficial in terms of yield. Rutabagas and turnips can be seeded through July, but not usually into August. But you can do some transplanting of both in early August and still be successful. And Swiss chard ongoing, still an option to plant. As we get past the second week of August, your options shrink dramatically on what you can and can't get away with. Arugula can still be seeded or transplanted into the end of August, maybe early September, for winter to spring with no fall harvest at all. And it'll be pretty light over the winter, usually mostly a spring harvest from that late. Overwintered carrots can be directly seeded through late August or early September. And often we will wait until it cools down a little bit in early September to do them. The charts will tell you you can do it through October. I've had pretty light success going as late as second week of October. I find early September is about the sweet spot for overwintering carrots for myself. Fava beans, this would be normal seeding period for favas in early September through maybe early October at the latest for June harvest. Corn salad, mache, seed in August or early September for winter to spring harvest. Can be seeded with some success through the end of September. All of your garlics and onions and shallots, the bulbs start coming available usually in September. Plant September or October for June, July harvest. If for some reason you still have too much crop in the ground, which honestly is not uncommon for me, I do plant kind of dense. You have a lot of summer stuff that's not out until October. Well, you can still plant garlic November, even December, January. Just your yield diminishes, but it can still be quite successful. So that's one of your options. If everything else gets away from you, you can still get in. Lettuce. Lettuce is, we've talked about it being sensitive to too much heat. It's also sensitive to too little in terms of germination. Now, not as much as cole crops. It's a little bit different. And I have seeded lettuce even in early February and had lettuce grow just so slow it wasn't worth doing it. So theoretically, you can seed quite late. In practice, once you get beyond the end of August, your best bet is to transplant it. Transplanting through the end of October is still good. For base, even with covers, when you're going this late, you're probably not going to have any winter harvest. You're planning for spring that late. Mustards could be seeded through maybe the latter part of August, but mostly as we're getting into the tail end of August, first part of September, we'll transplant them. There's usually some availability of mustards quite late into the fall. October plantings get a little dicey. It'd be mostly spring harvest. If you're going for winter harvest, earlier is better. Peas seeded in September through early October, late March, early April harvest. I get about 50-50 on getting any peas out of that, and mostly because I don't pay enough attention to protecting them in terms of structural support. They get beaten up in a bad hailstorm. Radishes, maybe the 1st of October would be kind of your tail end. They are a brassica, so as the soil temperatures plummet, they do start losing their ability to germinate well. Planting's done maybe late September or 1st of October. We'll be harvesting late October, early November. Remember, we said 21 to 30 days peak season, but we're not peak season this late, and it's going to take a bit longer. So how to make this all work, put this all together? You have to kind of plan it ahead, as you can see from the timeline. For your fall and winter garden, you need to have things going in the ground while your summer crops are still maturing. And so you have to kind of plan that space. So a couple of things about that. Plan ahead, leave some space. This is, as I mentioned at the outset, it's probably a good year for doing that, as a lot of people are struggling to get any kind of garden in with our wet weather at all. I'm still only about 90% of my regular summer garden in. It's been too wet. So plan ahead, leave some space so that you don't have everything crowded and you do have some allowance for some fall and winter gardening. The alternative to that is to make use of space that earlier maturing crops are vacating, whether that's a planting of radishes, it's coming out very soon, whether that's peas, which will peter out in the hottest part of the summer usually, or overwintered cauliflower, broccoli, cabbage plants that are coming out harvesting out in April or so. That space could be available for summer crops, or could be left intentionally for a fall and winter crop. Even spring cauliflower and spring cabbage, things that are planted in as early as maybe February, March, and are maturing in June or maybe early July, that's a nice window. Garlic comes out in usually late June, early July, onions just thereafter. So there's often some space left behind from those. But when you're making use of space that other crops have been in, it's really, really critical to rotate your crops so you're not building up disease or insect problems. So learn your basic crop families. And one of the problems with doing this in rotations in the fall and winter garden is a lot of the space that typically comes available in June are relatives of crops you're going to want to put in for fall crops. There's a lot of space that opens up from like cauliflower and brock that you can't then go back and put cauliflower or brock or Brussels sprouts in because they have the same problems. So your basic crop families relevant to this time of year specifically, Brassicas. So all of your cole crops, your broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, kohlrabi, the leaf crop kale and mustards and collards, some minor leaf crops, bok choy and cress, but also the root crops, radishes, turnips, and rutabagas. Those are all brassicas. They share a range of serious disease problems and quite a bit of insect susceptibility. The umbellifers is a fancy way of saying the parsley family or the carrot family. And what you're likely to have in for fall crops, it would be carrots and parsnips in that group. But some summer crops that are also would be relevant would be parsley, celery, and cilantro. The chenopods are a fun group because they're leaf crops that aren't related to other things so much. There are some really good fall and winter crops. The root crop, beets, is a chenopod. The leaf crops, spinach and chard, are also chenopods. And the seed or sometimes leaf crops, amaranth and quinoa, are chenopods. Legumes, beans and peas. Beans does include fava beans. Composite, these are sunflower family. So a lot of actual winter greens are sunflower family. Lettuce, chicory, endive, radicchio. Summer crops, sunflowers and artichoke are also composites. Artichoke is less of an issue with rotation because they tend to live several years in the garden. And your allium family is, of course, your garlic, onions, shallots, also includes your bunching onions, leeks, and the herb chives. So always plant a gap between crops that are closely related. Plant something that's unrelated in between. It'd be really nice if you can get 2 years between, but in a small garden, that's not always practical. But learn the basic families, practice good rotation. If you don't, you will sometimes get away with it. When you don't get away with it, you're likely to have a serious problem. So, sorry, I flipped too much. Feeding and watering. One of the challenges to summer gardening is getting transplants established and even more so, getting seed germinated. You've got your summer garden in, we assume you're watering it somewhat regularly at that point, but new transplants will need a little extra attention, and newly seeded, direct seeded crops need a lot more attention. You can't let that seed dry out during its germination cycle or you'll have spotty or failed germination. Some crops that's not such a big issue on. Radishes are up really fast. You just have to keep watering them a little bit extra for a few days and then you've got them. Other crops are much more challenging. Onions and in particularly carrots are really difficult because they take a very long period to germinate. Carrots are my bane. Parsnips are the same, by the way. Often taking 3 weeks to germinate. I'm often out there, gave up on them, start planting a new crop behind them, and 2 or 3 days after I put the new batch of seed out, I realized, yes, they're finally sprouting. So seeding crops, direct seeding crops in July and August will require extra attention. And you may need to get out there and hand water daily, or if we have a really hot spell in this period of time, maybe even twice a day to make sure that seed bed is staying moist during the germination period. Once they've developed up, you can reduce that frequency. And in the garden as a whole, of course, you'll need to water things consistently, but even as early August, you can start feeling the difference. Yes, we're baking hot, but the days are getting shorter, the nights are getting longer and somewhat cooler. water demands goes down, and you can decrease that watering frequency to avoid constantly saturating them and causing rot problems. Even an established garden that you spent lots of prep time on in the spring, maybe you fertilized the whole garden, put a good manure layer on and tilled that in, whatever. Understand that that was great for your spring plantings, but your new plantings that are going in the summer need to be fed. All that nutrient that you put in the spring has been utilized by something, either by plants or by bacteria or fungal organisms. It has been utilized. So you need to refresh. So do refresh your soil in terms of soil structure with compost if needed, but definitely do add granular fertilizers, organic nutrients to the soil. We want to get that maturing crop developing out. They'll certainly struggle along without too much nutrition, but you really want to get that size up. And what happens, as I mentioned earlier, the nights are getting cooler and longer, soil temperatures are declining. As those soil temperatures decline, soil bacterial activity and other biological activity declines along with it. And at a certain point, as we're getting late into the season, especially like late September and into October, you'll find that organic granular fertilizers are not working as well because they are dependent on that soil biology to break them down into forms plants can use. So it's really valuable to plan on doing some liquid feeding. There's some great liquid organic fertilizers available, or you can make your own as compost teas or fertilizer teas. And you can apply those to the leaves as well as to the soil in the later part of the season. This is really important for things that are going to continue growing into the winter, like winter leaf crops, on things that are long-term overwintering crops like garlic and onions, to make sure that you're getting some nutrition on them. So a kind of a coherent plan for me is I'll put these crops in, like, well, a good example would be garlic. I plant my garlic as early in September as I can get away with it, and I'll put a granular feed in when I'm feeding them. I will supplement them in late October and often again in late November with a liquid fertilizer. Because I'm not trying to harvest them over winter, I don't push them any further through the winter. But as we start seeing the new growth pushing out a bit in mid-February, I'll hit them with liquid again before they get into finishing their crop cycle. So this is a good way to get some of these later crops going. It's also, if you get a late start and you notice something's just not pushing fast enough on your traditional organic fertilizing regime, take a moment in late August or early September to push it along to get it to size up with a little bit of extra liquid nutrition. Bugs and slugs are a bit of a problem through the winter garden, just like they are through the rest of the garden. And one of the challenges with summer gardening, summer planting, is there's a lot more active insects, a lot more large populations of insects in June and July than there were back in April and May when you're putting in the spring garden. So you do need to keep a very careful eye out for traditional pests, beetle damage, aphid damage. They come on a lot harder in June and July than they would back in May. So keep a careful eye out, treat at the first sign of damage. There's great organic solutions to most major insect problems. I use neem quite a bit for that. Pyrethrins are also available. For some pests, there are essential oil like capsaicin and cinnamon oil stuff that do a fair job. Some specific pests you need to pay a little more attention to. So cole crops, including kale, but also rutabagas and turnips, can get cabbage root maggot. So this is a fly that lays its eggs right against the stem of very young plants, and then the larva goes down into the root system and eats the roots off. And usually your first sign that there's a problem is your young transplants, 3 or 4 inches tall, just suddenly bend over and then wilt and then collapse and they're gone. This isn't a problem when you're doing this planting in May and June, or even March and April for spring and summer cole crops. But by the time you're in the late June, early July, the populations of insects are pretty high. So usually I will put a cover over my cole crops just to give them that little extra boost along. I cover them immediately at transplant. I don't do a lot of direct seeding of coles. I find it inefficient. And leave it on for about 3 to 4 weeks. And so this little lightweight summer insect barrier will keep those flies out of those developing crops. In 3 or 4 weeks, when they're getting to be around 6 inches or so, the flies are no longer attracted to them, and you're much less likely to have a problem. If you do a fairly extensive planting and you don't cover it, and you notice your first couple of plants declining, you pluck them out, you find the maggots down there in the roots, they're visible, you can see them. You might be able to get control of them by drenching the soil around each remaining plant with neem or with Spinosad, Captain Jack's. That's a good organic insecticide. I've had some success in saving partial crops, at least, with soil drenches once a problem has developed. Carrots and onions also have root maggot problems. On onions, I find it pretty hit and miss. Carrots, these midsummer plantings, it's not uncommon. Because carrots are not normally transplanted, you kind of have to time it. You need to wait for the germination to happen, because even the lightweight insect barriers do reduce the light and may slow down your germination. So once you start seeing a decent amount of germination coming out on your plantings, put your cover over, and again, leave them on for 4 to maybe 6 weeks while those carrots are beginning to size on. Once you've gone through a couple of thinnings, your risk is pretty much gone. As I mentioned a few slides ago, aphids don't stop in the winter. So while our beetle and even our cabbage looper and caterpillar problems decline fairly dramatically through the winter cycle, aphids don't. And on winter and overwintered cole crops, it's very essential that you keep an eye on aphids. Aphids are a problem on a lot of our root crops too, especially, again, the Brassica root crops. So monitor right after planting and continually through the late summer, fall, and winter. And when you see aphids, treat them immediately. At least in the winter, they slow down their reproduction rate a bit. At first, your late summer plantings are going to be less troubled by slugs and snails because of the heat and the dehydration level, unless you're constantly watering. That changes pretty fast as the days shorten. And so iron phosphate baits are a good idea, especially for your winter and overwinter crops. Particularly leaf crops and cole crops are hammered by slugs. So pay attention to any damage, treat as need be. Iron phosphate baits is not just about being organic and pet safe. Iron phosphate baits are more effective than metaldehyde baits in wet weather. Metaldehyde baits not only are reasonably toxic, but paralyze the slug or snail until it dehydrates to death. Well, as we get into late fall and winter, they may never dehydrate to death. Pretty constant moisture level in the atmosphere and precipitation. So they can often live long enough for the metaldehyde to wear off and they crawl away. Iron phosphate is actually a stomach toxin for slugs and snails, and being pet safe is just a generally good thing anyway. So that's usually my go-to slug bait. Protecting winter crops. So most of them don't need tons. That's why we do them as winter crops. But leaf crops, if you're really intending to pick leaf crops later than about the end of October, you'll get better yields with using some sort of a temperature increasing cover. Some crops really need it. Lettuce is the notable one. If you're going to try to get them through the winter at all, you're going to have to cover them. So remade brand or fleece type covers, like you see in the picture there, the white fabric covers, are very effective and easy because you can just drape them lightly over right on top of the plants pretty easily. If you got weak or flimsy plants or plants that are still actively growing much, you might want to put a couple of posts or hoops in to give them some support above the leaf, but they can be draped over plants without in physical contact. Other ways to provide winter protection include cloches, pre-made frames with usually hard plastic, occasionally soft plastic, or fancy ones are glass, that cover small individual plants or very short rows, can provide quite a bit of protection. You can also build more solid structures yourself of more substantial size, whether that's a hoop house structure with clear plastic or a wood frame structure with clear plastic. Relative degrees of temperature, insulation, and protection vary quite a bit. You know, your remay and fleece produce somewhere between, or protect somewhere between 2 and maybe 5 or 6 degrees, maybe as high as 7 degrees at the most of insulation value. Cloches are usually a bit more than that. Framed in structures, if they're well sealed and using a pretty decent thermal grade of plastic, will give you maybe 5 to 7 degrees, maybe 8 degrees of insulation. And also are typically more easily accessible. So some variation there. Keep in mind that hard covers, whether it's a soft plastic, clear plastic, hard plastic, or glass, should not be in contact with the foliage of the plants because you'll get burns. Remember that besides leaf crops, overwintered cauliflower needs protection. Winter harvest and overwintered cauliflower needs protection. So kind of a summary of what we went through today. Plan ahead, find or leave or create space, and keep in mind the rotations. Plant on time. That's the big takeaway I want. This is why we schedule this class here in late June rather than later in the season. If we try to do this class in July, it's getting too late for some options. So plant on time for the crop you're wanting to grow and for when you're planning to harvest it. Amend and fertilize the soil at planting. Nutrients are gone by now from spring improvements. Consistent watering is important, and extra attention to both the new transplants and particularly new direct seedings is critical. Bugs and slugs need to be monitored and controlled, not only in the early growing season, but even through the winter on long cycle crops. Liquid fertilizers can help increase size rapidly or when fertilizers decrease in effectiveness due to soil temperature, and protect your more sensitive crops, winter leaf crops and cauliflower in particular, from severe cold weather to improve your harvest. All right, phew, that was a mouthful all at once. At this point in time, I would like to open up to any additional questions. And yes, I do see missed the first few minutes of the presentation. Can you get a copy? We don't provide copies, but this entire presentation will be posted on our YouTube channel. It may take us a week, it sometimes does, but that's the plan, and you can look it up from our YouTube channel. Other questions? You can either put it in chat or you can unmute yourself and ask verbally.
What do you use for aphids, and what do you use for, I guess my question is, when you're looking for insects and pests and you're spraying with like neem or something like that, how is that for a person to intake that? How is it intaked into the plant?
Very good. So relative degrees of organic insecticide, there's a lot of them out there. Insecticidal soaps work really well on soft-bodied insects, but have no duration. They're pretty much affecting literally what you hit with them when you spray it. The essential oil ones, whether it's cinnamon oil or capsaicins, are more effective generally at disrupting reproductive strategies than they are at actually killing individual insects. Those two, I wouldn't drink them, but are inherently quite safe. Spinosad. So it'll be Spinosad of the Captain Jack's is one of the brand names out there. Is very effective on certain insects, particularly certain aphids, other insects that have larval stages that can be affected by Spinosad, like certain beetles, not the adults, but their larval stage, and is very mammal safe. No problems with human toxicity at all. Neem and pyrethrin. So pyrethrin, a few people have allergic reactions to. Same thing with neem. They're direct plant extracts. They're relatively safe, and particularly neem. So if you look at your labeling on neem, it is listed as for use up to the day of harvest on most crops. Neem does have a rather unpleasant bitter flavor if you actually leave a little bit too much on, or if you especially leaf crops. So I will spray right up to the day of harvest on fruit crops. That includes vegetable fruits like zucchinis and tomatoes. Anything I'm going to wash anyway, because it'll come right off. Leaf crops and herb crops, I will tend to leave 4 or 5 days between last application and consumption, and I'm not worried about a health risk at that point. It can affect the quality, the flavor quality of the crop. Pyrethrin is harder on bees than neem. The other reason I tend to use neem. Neem also has decent persistent, like a lot of the pyrethrins do. So neem will kill what you hit with it, but will continue to kill insects that are feeding on that plant for maybe 4 or 5 days, which gives us a really nice control period on things that are mobile, like beetles in particular. My default usually is I keep neem in the cupboard so I can go out and spray of an evening and control what I need to. Yes, you can be more targeted and use even less intense products, but then you have to make sure you have those products on hand when you need them. And for things like beetles, I find insecticidal soap in particular and those essential oil products fairly ineffective on. I really like pyrethrin or neem for the harder shelled insects. Best spraying, watch days like today is too hot to spray even in the evening. We're going to be, 95 to 97 today. It's still going to be 80 degrees at sundown. You can burn with some of these organic products in particular. So be a little cautious. Even if you're using synthetics, be cautious. A lot of the carrier agents are phytotoxic at temperature. I usually try to spray in the evening regardless. It gives you best degree of insect control. A lot of your insects that are feeding here are nocturnal. So if you spray as close to dark as possible, not only are you cooler, but you tend to have a better effectiveness on a lot of these migratory insects.
What about BT?
BT, okay, so BT and Spinosad are very similar. BT is an actual bacteria, Bacillus thuringiensis. Spinosad, so what happens with a bacterial? It gets inside the insect, usually through ingestion or sometimes through the pores, reproduces inside the host body and gives off these bacterial protein toxins. And that's what actually kills the bug. It's not the feeding, it's the toxins they're given off. Spinosad is a select group, usually spinosyn A plus spinosyn D of that family. So of bacterial toxins. They're bacterial protein toxins created through the fermentation of sugarcane. So it's more stable and more persistent. BT itself is effective. It is particularly effective against caterpillars. It's much less effective against a whole batch of other insects, where Spinosad has both a little more persistence and a little more range of insects control.
And one last question. Thank you. I appreciate it. How long do they last? When I buy a thing of BT.
Right. So BT is the least stable of the batch. BT older than a year and a half, I throw away. Spinosad, similarly less stable over time. More than 2 years, I certainly won't bother keeping it. Neem, it can separate out and saponify out, making it hard to work with, but it's an oil base, so you can usually keep it for several years as long as it doesn't freeze or not left with the bottle exposed to sunlight for long periods of time, both of which can actually change the chemical compositions. Pyrethrin is in between those two. Insecticidal soap is probably the most stable of the batch all in all in terms of long-term stability in the bottle.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Yeah, anytime. Thank you. All right. Question. Any suggestions to keep birds and squirrels away? For squirrels, there are organic repellents. They're used as barriers, not right on the plant usually, but as behavioral barriers. They're scent repellents. Somewhat effective, not perfectly effective. Borders, nets. For birds, often netting is the issue. Okay, let me give you a little story though about birds. So birds in fruit crops are one thing. They do enough damage, it's probably significant enough to control. China, Red Revolution period, right? The government decided that they were losing too much crops to the sparrows, right? Because the sparrows were eating a lot of the leaf crops and the rice crops and whatever. And so they decided to put a bounty on sparrows. And there you get some pictures of that era where you got kids holding these stringers with 200 dead sparrows because they were getting money for every sparrow they killed. 5 years later, they were importing sparrows from Russia because the sparrows were also, despite they were feeding on some crops, they were also eating so many insect pests that once the sparrows were gone, the crops were much the worse for insect damage. So a little bit of bird feeding on the leaf crops, just smile and realize you probably won't have too many loopers out there to be weeding out of your coals. But fruit crops definitely need protection. Netting is really the only efficient way of keeping birds out of a crop. May work for squirrels too, may not. Squirrels can go through small net, they can chew through net, and they can tunnel under. So it depends on how bad your squirrel problem really is. Ultimately, a bad case of squirrels involves building fences or other structures, usually with chicken wire and usually with some of it buried or skirt buried so they can't really go right under it. Zucchinis in Nebraska group. Zucchinis are not. Zucchinis are zucchinis are cucurbits. We didn't talk about that because there aren't any cucurbits for the fall and winter garden to speak of. Cucurbits are squashes, melons, and cucumbers and gourds. And that's important for your summer rotations. And for next year, don't plant your zucchini where you grew your melons last year because they have some similar pest problems. All right. Looks like we made it through questions in chat. Anybody else have anything they wanted to ask while we're here? Oh, I see some things. Good. Okay. Okay. Planted potatoes in a bag. So these would be ready. Yeah, it depends on which type of potatoes. So the earliest maturing varieties you usually see are something between 55 and 60 days or so. So planted from last week would be maybe September. Later harvesting varieties, yeah, October would be typically the thing. So potatoes in a bag, they'll actually probably develop a little faster in a bag than they would in the native soil because they're heating. The soil is heating more, so that will actually increase the amount of degree days you're getting for each cycle. Watering is critical in those grow bags. It's not a bad thing to do. I've done it that way. It's a lot of fun, but they do dry out pretty fast, so keep an eye on them. And that becomes increasingly an issue as you get up to flower. When you start seeing the flower buds develop, you know that they're going to suddenly start using twice as much water as they were using during the vegetative growth cycle. So feed them or water them more substantially heavily. You'll do that through the flowering cycle. Shortly after the flowers wither, you'll start seeing the foliage begin to yellow from the base up and realize that's a normal part of the development process. When you see that happening and you're maybe a quarter of the way up is yellow, stop watering entirely and just let them finish off that way. The foliage will finish yellowing up, the foliage will collapse, your potatoes will be fine there in the bag. You can either start harvesting out the sides or you can dig the whole crop at that point in time. But it's really important to get that separation from water in the late part of the cycle, because if they're too wet close to harvest, they won't skin appropriately and they won't store well. And that can be a problem if we get into really, really late harvests of potatoes. Is even the rain can do that for you, and then you're fighting that end of it. All right, well, I want to thank you all for attending, appreciate it. And that calls an end to the class for the day. You guys know where to find me here at Shonnard's. If you have any follow-up questions, I'd be happy to get them on the phone or an email, so give me a buzz. Thank you very much.